We have yet more Epic Games Store drama. EA have had their earnings call, the scope of crunch at Naughty Dog has been revealed, and far more in today's roundup. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Roundup. There's been so much news this week, we've had to do 3 of them, and remember, we are currently hiring a writer position for this channel, writer and researcher, so if you're passionate about games news, hit up the link below. Okay, let's get started. So Electronic Arts have had their earnings call, and you would think it would be a disaster given Anthem, but surprisingly, that's not really the case. As compared to their previous guidance, EA are actually doing quite well. This is all off the back of Apex Legends, which has performed quite well, and The Sims 4, which together with FIFA Ultimate Team have had their live service bookings go up 12% year over year. The main area where they're down is mobile, and they're down 17%, but that's because they haven't released anything, they have old games there, and they've said they're working on it. Apex Legends does have a mobile version in the works, but they say that will be more like a 2021 release date, which certainly is late to the punch. And yeah, you would think that Anthem nosediving would have hurt them a lot in the most recent quarter, but that does not appear to be the case, with their share price going up 10% after the earnings call. I think it turns out that Anthem just was not much compared to the other segments of their business, and I suppose Apex ended up doing quite well. I think it's a little bit sad that they can garner so much bad will through their actions, yet still do so well. I think if anything, it really does just show us why these business practices do continue. They end up working. FIFA Ultimate Team, it's disagreeable, but it sadly does work. That's not all with EA though, they had a little bit of drama. So an analyst suggested that The Sims would be a perfect fit for the Switch, and Andrew Wilson disagreed. Referencing internal data, he said that lots of Switch owners already buy and play EA games, they just do it on other platforms, and they basically don't believe there are enough Switch-only players who are willing to buy their games. Essentially, he thinks that for the EA properties, gamers follow the game, not the platform. And I say thinks, ultimately EA do have far more data than we do there, so he's probably closer to knowing than we are. And sure, we can make arguments about how much you might want to go and play FIFA on a Switch at your friend's house, but they've clearly crunched the numbers here and they do not think it's worth the effort. Indeed, it seems like maybe getting Frostbite to run on the Switch is quite a challenge there. Back in 2017, we did see a FIFA producer pretty much say they need another engine if it was going on the Switch. Now, I mean, that said, I think people would like to play those titles on the Switch, and I suppose it's probably more down to EA trying to be as financially efficient as they can be, only going for what generates the most profit per money spent. Perhaps they just don't see the value in trying hard here, even though they could stand to gain a little bit. I think they're really missing out though, and maybe say some of the BioWare RPGs, like even having Mass Effect on the Switch or Jade Empire or something like that. But again, as evidenced by their earnings call, does selling games like that even matter to them that much in the face of live service and subscription revenue? I think that's the question we're really left with, seeing how well they've done, even though they have had a lot of problems. Next up, we've got an opportunity to talk about crunch. So, COG Connected spoke to over a dozen former Naughty Dog employees about crunch at the studio, and the story seems to echo a lot of other ones from the industry, although with a seemingly interesting positive twist. So, Naughty Dog is a storied studio credited with some of gaming's best games, and that's actually where the issues sort of begin. According to many sources, crunch is never mandated by the studio, yet it just happens anyway. And the pressure to crunch comes from 2 places. Personally, to meet Naughty Dog standards, and then from colleagues in the same team. And the key term used by many of the sources was peer pressure. No one wants to be the weakest link in such an esteemed studio, and they're really incensed by the team's lofty goals, so they push themselves to the limit. Apparently, Naughty Dog have no dedicated managers. That's a thing they pride themselves on. It's a part of their company structure, and their department leads, they manage their teams on top of doing the work themselves. And I suppose because there's less structure, that means that social factors, factor in more. So despite apparently never actively encouraging crunch and sometimes trying to avoid it, there is basically a strong sense in the company that they're all in the trenches together. Now, while the crunch is never enforced by management apparently, some sources have claimed that it effectively is mandatory, with one developer saying that the sheer size of their workload actually forces crunch to happen. They claim that the schedule demands extreme amounts of work, and and if developers can't meet their work quota, they'll be reprimanded and ultimately be fired. This developer said they were told off for missing a weekend and for not working, quote, at least 14-hour days despite getting their work done. That developer actually spoke to Sony HR about this, who responded by saying, quote, they'll get used to Naughty Dog's way of doing things. Then one of the major concerns expressed here is that Naughty Dog supports crunch, even if they don't technically enforce it. So they will happily get dinner in for the developers who are crunching. They will happily approve and pay for tons of overtime. Let the people do it. And most importantly, they don't really do much to discourage crunch. Heading home at a reasonable time could result in you missing out on important decisions and feeling excluded from the team. Basically, the systems and behavior all support it, even if it's not really officially addressed. Now, beyond that, the story is almost identical to others. QA people being treated worse than the core development team, with stricter schedules and more pressure to do overtime. Supposedly, QA were not allowed to attend yoga sessions that were intended for the devs, and dinner was rarely provided for QA alone. It was only brought in if the devs were also staying in and had dinner, and like with Treyarch, the QA people would only get that dinner if, the devs pretty much had leftovers. Contractors across the company were also treated differently, according to one QA contractor who brought up a company-wide invite to a party that explicitly excluded contractors. They say that they were working as hard as the full-time employees, but they just never really felt like they were a part of Naughty Dog. Though almost contradicting those sources, others do say that Naughty Dog allowed team members who suffer from burnout to take time off or to take reduced hours, and that this includes contractors and that there are no repercussions. The catch is that many people don't want to avail of this for fear of being less reliable than others, being seen that way, which I think is something that's kind of obvious if somebody feels like they're in a cutthroat industry. While it's not a nice feeling if somebody does a better job than you, they're going to be hired over you. That's the reality of a competitive industry, especially where going above and beyond is kind of supported and allowed. And really, I suppose that's it. If somebody feels like, hey, I want to work more hours, it works where I am at life, I want to do that overtime, that works for me, at what point do you say, no, you can't do that because it's not fair to the other people? I think that's a very interesting question to grapple with. Now, another source attests that Naughty Dog do treat their employees very well, with the developers saying that they really enjoyed their time there, arguing that the media misunderstands what crunch actually looks like. So basically here, there were conflicting reports about Naughty Dog, with some singing their praises and others kind of warning of a little bit of tyranny here and there. What is clear, though, is that Naughty Dog employees are expected to work extremely hard, and that they're upfront about this as a part of their culture. Much like what CD Projekt Red have said in the past, it's not the approach for everyone. That doesn't make it the right way to run a studio, but reports here do seem a lot less dehumanizing than with other studios. If working this hard is what it takes to be industry leaders, and whoever joins is doing that willingly and they are well compensated, then I suppose by all means go for it. But when employees are pressured or forced into doing that overtime and their jobs are kind of on the line, and if they don't pull 14-hour days, and when QA and contractors are treated less fairly, then we start to have issues. And unfortunately, those problems do seem to be present here. This type of work is often far less time efficient when it's being done in crunch. That can cause projects to not run smoothly, to burn through funds quite fast, and to accrue all sorts of technical debt. And it might work for Naughty Dog now, but I'll say this. Like with BioWare, what will happen when the magic doesn't pull it together in the end? What will happen if they release their first flop? Some of those practices may need to be rethought. And then moving on to Epic Games Store news, we've got a few different exclusives, and I think just an interesting perspective into what Epic wants. So first off, MechWarrior 5. The CEO of the company was on a podcast with a community member for the MechWarrior series, and they basically explained their reasoning was twofold. Reason number one was the revenue split. So if they release the game in Steam, they'll have to cede 30% to Valve. They'll also have to give 5% to Epic because they're developing in the Unreal Engine. Though if they go with Epic, they'll only be giving up 12% because of the reduced split, and then Epic will waive the Unreal Engine licensing fee when selling through them. That means for their projection of 1 million sales at $50 base price, they'll get an additional $10 million. And hey, $10 million is nothing to scoff at. The other reason, they say, is the game's visibility and exposure. The CEO lamented the size and speed of Steam's market, saying that when they update their other games there and try to get some exposure in the store, they're buried again within 10 hours. He said that he expects them to be in the front page of the Epic Games Store for a month or more, and that would basically mean more eyeballs than they would get on Steam. And that's especially the case given the large projected user base injection on the Epic Store when Borderlands 3 launches and brings people over there. Now, in response to this news, only around 3% of customers asked for a refund on the first day, and they handled those pre-orders themselves, unlike in the Shenmue case, where Epic paid for the refunds because of the debacle that it caused. Now, as a nice little addition, pre-orders of MechWarrior 5 did come with bonus content for MechWarrior Online, and they are allowing people who are getting refunds to keep their MechWarrior Online stuff, which I suppose is a pretty solid gesture. And then there's another game that Epic have snatched up called Ooblets, and this is for an entirely different reason. So, their developers have basically said that the reason is that the money's coming up front from Epic. They claim that Epic's offer for a minimum guaranteed number of sales matched what they wanted to earn for their game across all different stores, and that basically going with Epic gives them a lot of job security. Now, since the money is coming up front, it means they can afford development assistance to ramp up production and increase the scope of the game where they wanted to. Effectively, Epic have funded the remainder of development and maybe a bit more for this indie, and that does kind of blur the line between a storefront and a publisher. And while it seems they'd have made release regardless, they can do basically a lot more here than they could have done with the original budget. They could have plainly explained that, and I think a lot of people would have understood that, but they unfortunately wrote a very undiplomatic blog post. In between the lines, there was a lot of venom. It was really not that nice at all, and I think they spent a lot of time differentiating themselves and who they think their audience is from people who are displeased with Epic's business practices. And doing that is, it's sort of dehumanizing, it's condescending, it's not how to build bridges, and it's a prime example of terrible community management. Now, I think these two examples are exactly what Epic are aiming for, and that's the thing we can learn here. You've got a big developer who wants to be in a less chaotic marketplace and earn more revenue because of the cut. Then you've got an indie who are struggling to keep the lights on, and they want to get some money up front to help them be sustainable and have their job security. And while many of these decisions are leaving them well and truly, disliked by some of their customers, Epic do seem to be successful in providing that value to those developers in those situations, and I think that's why you are seeing these things continue in spite of the backlash. And then next, let's just crush our way through the quickfire topics. So, Twitch have lost Ninja to Microsoft's competing streaming platform Mixer in a deal that esports consultant Luke Cotton estimates to be worth $40 million a year. Then Red-Eye also told people to stay tuned, indicating that other big talent acquisitions could be on the horizon. Twitch have been under a lot of scrutiny recently, so it'll be interesting to see if Mixer have played their hand right this time. Competition, of course, is great for the market, though I'm sure some Ninja fans won't enjoy having to hop between the platforms, though unlike Epic and Steam, this situation is different. It's not about something that somebody owns, and that does make that comparison quite limited, even though many do seem to be trying to make it as a hot take. Then next up, Bungie have decided to delay their Shadowkeep expansion by 2 weeks, citing a lack of satisfaction in their current progress. This was announced via a blog post that mentioned that they're doing this now because they're free from Activision, they control their schedule, and they also apologized to people who had made plans based on the release date. And really, it's good to see the likes of Bungie and Digital Extremes with Warframe have control over their timelines, because ultimately it's better for the quality of their games and it's better for their employees. Then next up, Nintendo are slowly moving into the modern day by putting modern value adds into Switch Online. So there's a trial, there's a game trial service that's starting with Mario Tennis Aces and some free Smash DLC. They've got a lot of catching up to do in this one, admittedly, but it's a good start. Then next up, Google has had their $5 per month premium app and game subscription be leaked. Yes, this seems to be competing with Apple Arcade, but right now it's just hard to see how the services will stack up because we don't have full lineups. But I will say this, right? I actually believe in mobile a lot. Not how it currently is, but I think premium games on mobile, that could be really good. There's some really good narrative games. You've got things like 80 Days, Monument Valley. There's real quality content there. It's just so sad that mobile is so dominated by basically free-to-play trash. So I'll say this. If Apple Arcade and this thing from Google cause a resurgence in premium mobile games, that could be a really good thing for that platform. And I know mobile's not for everybody, but it could be good. And there we go, that's it for another episode of the Roundup. It's been so good finally just being able to jump back into work properly this week. That's why there's been a lot more content on the channel. And yeah, if you're interested in that job opening we have, take a look in that description down below. A big thank you to everyone who is subscribed to this channel, watches these videos, and a massive thank you to the patrons who really are making this whole thing a lot more possible. So Cheers, everyone. I'll see you next time.